Let's talk about what's going on in China. China is protesting COVID lockdowns. The people of China are, and it's massive, over basically 12 different regions as of this afternoon, from what we can tell. And the mainstream media is comparing this to the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. They're saying that this is historic, that it's an indication of the downfall of the government of China. But is it? I mean, this is the way the Western media is portraying it. Just go to the front page of Drudge today. Go to CNN.com. Go to any of the Western media coverage, and you'll see that, right? Let's take a pause and take a look at what is actually happening here. Those of us who went through the harsh lockdowns, we can sympathize up to a point. In Europe, we had very strict guidelines, but we were let out. Imagine if you saw no end in sight to that. I can't. Like, if you were, like, they just were like, no, there's no date in the future when you guys are going to be let out. Like, we don't even have a date. Oh, and then when we do, which we thought was going to be last week or 10 days ago, then we pull it back and we actually make it stricter on you. You know, that's like feeling like you're in some sort of a prison or some sort of a concentration camp, being held against your will, and you think you hear like Allied bombers. You're like, did I hear that? Did I really hear that? And then you come to find out, no, you didn't. No, that wasn't an Allied bomber at all. And that there is no hope. That's kind of what this is right now. It's too hard on the human psyche. I spoke to a source in China today who's been under constant lockdown. And this source told me how angry this person is. Won't name names. And really, really upsetting to the point where you can't even go to the hospital or doctor for anything if you are in these lockdown modes. Unbelievable. And we absolutely feel for these people and their families. We've featured this story on the show multiple times. I think, David, you remember, Philip, we showed the cages they were setting up on the streets to block people from leaving. The protests, the violent protests in the street when people, they just want to get some fresh air. Like,
well, they're actually literally like using like screw guns to like physically fix people's doors shut. You remember that?
Oh yeah.
Or they were like actually like boarding up their doors.
Or if there's COVID in the building, we're going to round up your pets and just euthanize your pets and throw them here. They are, bags of pets on the street. Really, really awful. But this is the upturn of the Chinese government that the mainstream media wants you. Well, that's the question. Is this the upturn or the overthrow of the Chinese government that the Western media wants you to believe? It's hard not to see that the media is stoking a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment that Western governments obviously love to stoke. We see this in other countries all the time. So it's easy for us to jump to that conclusions, Matt, right? Oh, these are all just paid U.S. actors, right? That's sort of the idea. Here are some of the headlines from the Western media. From the Financial Times: Xi Jinping faces stiffest challenge to rule as COVID outrage sparks mass protests. These people holding up, see those white papers he's holding? What they're doing is they're holding up white papers in protest using the glow of their cell phone like a lantern. Like, this is our solemn protest. Here's the BBC. Protesters openly urge President Xi to resign over China COVID curbs. Yeah, that's going to happen. The Financial Times calls this the largest threat against the government since the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. Protesters are calling for the resignation of President Xi Jinping, who's just begun his third term. Here is how CNN's Selena Wang explains this. Listen.
Paula, that is people in Shanghai calling Xi Jinping to step down over and over again. Those chants go on for quite some time. They're also calling for the Communist Party to step down. I can't overstate just how shocking it is to hear this crowd in Shanghai, China's wealthiest and most cosmopolitan city, and that chanting happening in a central upscale part of the city, to be directly calling out for Xi Jinping to resign. I mean, this is virtually unheard of. And in China, it is extremely dangerous to publicly criticize the party, especially Xi himself. You risk prison time or even worse. Some protesters also chanted they don't want COVID tests, they don't want dictatorship, they want freedom and democracy. Witnesses told CNN as well that rows of police officers were making arrests, forcefully pushing protesters into police cars. But the next day on Sunday, hundreds of Shanghai residents returned to continue protesting despite heavy police presence and roadblocks. Videos also showed some protesters violently dragged away, and now that area has been mostly cordoned off. But what we're seeing is this tipping point across the country after years of suffering and deaths during lockdowns because people struggle to get food, necessities, and emergency care in lockdown, Paula.
So she's clear. What's rare here is that the protest against the government, that this is a protest against the government, not the protests themselves. In fact, protests are not rare in China, although they would have you believe this in the West. Western media mostly pretends that protests in China never happen, or that when they do, they happen that they're somehow earth-shattering. But the fact of the matter is that the Atlantic let slip a few years ago, in this article, they describe why protests in China are not like the Arab Spring at all. In fact, how China stays stable despite 500 protests every day. Okay, here's from this article. Popular movements here seem to express relatively narrow complaints, want to work within the system rather than topple it and treat the Communist Party as legitimate. Protests appear to be part of the system, not a challenge to it, they write. A sort of release valve for popular anger that, if anything, could have actually strengthened the party by giving them a way to address that anger while maintaining autocratic rule. In the absence of real democracy, this give and take between state and society could actually help maintain political stability in China for now. So this should sure serve as a red flag to any of us who are not Chinese and who don't live there. This is a cultural movement, and we should not West-splain it. You know, like people who the mansplaining things, right? So maybe we shouldn't.
I like that.
We shouldn't West-splain it. I like that. My wife came up with that.
Did you invent it?
No.
Oh, did you? I was gonna ask if you did it. So
no,
okay.
no. She came up with West-splaining. I like that. I'll give her credit. And if we don't completely understand it, we just try to West-splain it away. You know. And look, sometimes it can be very difficult, like, you know, to not jump to conclusions. I saw a lot of people jumping to immediate conclusions on Twitter about this, you know, and you've got to be careful about it. It's best to like let the dust settle, speak to sources on the ground there, find out what's actually happening, and actually look at the historical context of these protests. The problem is that most people have a frame of reference from our Western media, which is a bunch of propaganda. So it's very, very difficult to sift through all of this and get the true stories. And we certainly should not extrapolate the fall of a government at this point. At this point, as this user put it on Twitter, Robert Barrick says, every single country with lockdowns has had public protests. Only the U.S.-funded China hate lobby and their brainwashed drones like squealer Drew Pavio are saying China protests signal the downfall of government. Victoria's didn't bring down Dan Andrews. So in the West, the media is exclaiming that the Chinese are finally standing up to police. In fact, that is not uncommon. They do stand up to police, as we showed you in videos from a year ago on this channel. Arnaud Bertrand is a Westerner who lives in China. This was his impression as a Westerner living in China when he first moved to China years ago. He said, that was one of my biggest surprises when first living in China. Seeing people shout at the police, surprisingly common. I was like, wait, don't these people just disappear? Once in Tianjin, I even heard a policeman tell a woman, if you bite the police again, you'll get arrested. Try doing that in America. Bite a police officer.
Oh, yeah, you'll be tackled by like 8 of them in a second.
Right.
We'll
call for backup.
Clips unloaded. You get shot doing that.
Yeah. If you do that, if you bite the police officer, ma'am, you're gonna get arrested. What is rare about these protests is that they are erupting all over China, and that they stemmed from a horrific event of an apartment fire that killed 10 people who were trapped inside during these lockdowns. They weren't allowed to leave. This highlights what people are so afraid of, being unsafe and confined with nowhere to go. And as Philip pointed out, like literally putting a plywood drilled into the doors to keep you from leaving. Contrary to what Westerners think, the Chinese government often does give in and actually listens to protests, surprisingly. Here's an example. coronavirus in China cites cities ease some rules, ban blocking of exits amid protests and surge in cases. The government will ease some restrictions and look into ordinances regarding blocking fire exits. In fact, this is what many of them were protesting for in the first place. Stop blocking the fire exits. The media is not showing you protesters demanding very reasonable things like better building inspections, because how sexy is that, right? We want better code violation. Is there a fire extinguisher in this hallway? That's what we're protesting. Oh, you're not protesting the overthrow of Xi Jinping? Now, then turn the cameras off, John. Like, we want to find something more sensational to report. Or an end date to lockdowns. Like, that's what they're protesting. They just want to know the end date of these lockdowns. They want to have a frame of reference. As one source told me today, they were under the impression that these restrictions were easing, and they got very excited. We saw the response in the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, right? It was jubilant like a week and a half ago. And then the lockdowns came back because of a spike in cases. And now those restrictions have disappeared, or went back in place, and the easing has gone away. I think this is something we Westerners have to be careful of. Said nicely by this user on Twitter, Sebastian Olsen GBD, says, real protests usually are about a particular issue, inadequate healthcare, end of subsidies, and so on. We hate the government. We want this person in charge instead, is a Western infantile view of what politics is all about. Arnaud Bertrand says, bullseye. So could it be, and we Westerners are asking this question, that the protests are not a government overthrow, but a demand for a different sort of living conditions, because this is the way the conversation is had between Chinese people and the Chinese government? Another American living in China posted this photo. And you can see in this photo, this is Mao Zedong. Why? Because he is a symbol of the founding of China, what they believe China should represent to serve the people, the People's Republic of China, which may mean that we should not boil down these protests to what the West thinks or a government overthrow is, but rather a justified uprising against a zero COVID policy that people should no longer have to live with when they see the rest of the world. And we are remiss if we don't also point out the hypocrisy here. Here's Justin Trudeau. I love this funny post. This is a satire post from Justin Trudeau's Ego Twitter account, which is one of my new favorite Twitter accounts, by the way. We're coordinating with the CBC here in Canada to determine how to report on the China uprising. My government is committed to painting them as righteous protesters and nothing like the Freedom Convoy truckers that we imprisoned. Anyone who draws comparisons will be reported to the RCMP trampling unit. Right? I mean, it's funny because it's true, right? Like, okay, so if China does it, then they are noble, righteous protesters. If they do it in Canada, then they're white supremacists who want to topple Canada, right? So you get the irony here. It's a joke account, but clearly points out the narrative that Canadian protesters were wrong and terrorists and white supremacists who posed no threat to the Trudeau administration whatsoever. But in China, boy, another story altogether, right? And we present this not to minimize the actions of anyone protesting at all. Not by a long shot. We agree with them. We do not agree with lockdowns. We are vehemently anti-COVID mandate policy on this show. Zero COVID policy is total garbage, as we've called out from the very beginning. It was never going to work, right? No amount of masks, no amount of rounding up and euthanizing their pets, no amount of putting cages out on the streets, no amount of using the little testers and the PCP tests and all of that garbage with any of that. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. It never was going to work. But we also don't want to speak for these people in China and come to some sort of hateful conclusion about their government either. That's one thing we need to be careful of. But the Western media doesn't care about that last part. They love to jump right to conclusions. And I even saw comments yesterday in my feed were like, but what about all the genocide of the Uyghur population? I'm like, boy, we have covered this story and we have debunked that extensively here on the show. So just go and seek those videos out if you want some further context for how that is total garbage and has been vehemently debunked by a number of journalists now. Even the United Nations themselves put up that phony report because they couldn't find any evidence of it.